welcome to the S.O.A.P video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We are working our way through the book of Jeremiah.
We are.
And we're past the halfway point. Yep. We're pushing toward the end here. And I have to tell you that, not only is it a fun book, there's a lot of repetition in it, prophecies and everything, but there's some good historical narrative.
Which is awesome.
But this section that we're reading this week is absolutely by far my favorite section in the book of Jeremiah.
Nice.
Because it has to do with the new covenant.
Right, exactly.
And some of the over these next couple of chapters, we're in chapters 31 to 34, over these couple of chapters, God uses some really dramatic language.
Right. Well,
it's
big.
To explain his covenants.
Exactly. Okay, so last week we saw that Babylon finally was attacked, right? Yeah, I don't know if that's a woo-woo.
Well, Jerusalem by Babylon, right? Jerusalem's finally attacked by Babylon.
Sorry. We'll edit that out. Somehow I think you'll leave that in. Yeah. And they were taken, and false teachers started popping up. And one of the false teachers said, hey, nothing to worry about. In 2 years, everybody will be back. No problem. And Jeremiah said, well, except God said 70 years. Yeah. And that was the big news last week, right? Yeah. Was that, 70 years that they're going to be in captivity.
And the guy said, well, I'll prove it in 2 years. And it's like, well, 2 months later, he's dead, and they're still in captivity.
Right, exactly. So Jeremiah's point was, you're going to be there for 70 years, have families, make some roots, expand, grow, and live.
Yep.
Yeah. So this week, and up to now, it's been all doom and gloom, right? Babylon is going to attack.
Yep.
Nothing is going to be good. And it's very true.
Yeah.
But we kind of see the other side of the coin, too. Yeah. There's hope or light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, we're starting, this really sort of goes back to chapter 29, where God says, I know the plans I have for you, plans for a future and a hope, right? And in chapters 30 and 31, and now ongoing, there's still the whole, Babylon is coming, because Jeremiah likes to jump back and forth, right? But we're seeing what are those plans that I have for you? And in chapters 30 and 31, they're in those days when I plant you back in your land. Those days are coming. Yeah. In those days, the days are coming. And that phrase is used repeatedly.
Yeah. And he says things like people will live in towns, though you'll have farms again. People and animals will flourish. I mean, things you want to hear, it sounds like, hey, life will be normal.
It's going to be back to not only back to the way it was, but better. I mean, we're talking Messiah's kingdom will finally be here on the planet.
Yes, but then the big news is God says he's going to make a new covenant with Israel.
Yep.
Right, Israel and Judah.
Yep.
And that was one of the landmarks there, that we weren't talking about something right now, that it was in the future.
Yeah.
Right, because Israel had been broken into two. The northern kingdom is gone. We're now talking about Jerusalem, the southern kingdom that's going to be attacked. And God's already talking Israel as in both again,
Israel
together.
And Judah.
Yeah,
right now, Israel doesn't exist. I mean, they were taken into Assyria 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? It's just been Judah for 100 years. Yeah. But God says, in the future, in those days, when I plant you back in the land. There are a lot of people who talk about the new covenant today, the church. The passage clearly says, in those days, when I plant you back into your land, I will make a new covenant with Israel and Judah. How hard is this?
Right. Right.
And the reason they need a new covenant
Go ahead.
Is because they broke the old covenant.
Well, not like once. Right. They could never keep it.
Right? Yeah, it's true.
So God says words like, hey, this new covenant is not like the old covenant that you had with Moses, where Israel violated the covenant. And, God says, yet I was faithful in there. Yeah. So what's different in there, what we have in Jeremiah, is God's law is going to be written on the hearts and minds of the people of Israel,
instead of just on stone tablets. Right?
I mean, stone tablets, or you write it down and you tape it to yourself so you can remember it. The king doesn't have to write it down anymore. It's kind of cool.
Yeah,
right?
It will be in them.
Yeah, right. Hearts and minds. Everyone will know God, and Jerusalem will be rebuilt and never destroyed again.
Yeah,
which is kind of interesting, and it also kind of leads you to think, maybe Israel or maybe Jerusalem will be destroyed again.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is what we would say is the key passage for the new covenant. It does show up in other places, smaller places. Ezekiel 36 has some of similar information. It also talks about some of the physical things that are going to happen. The vineyards and the animals, and the buildings and stuff.
So I know it says all over the place, Israel, Judah, right, for them. But as Christians, I want everything.
Yeah.
Right. God's word in hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Is that anything for Christians?
No.
Is that promised anywhere?
No.
Okay.
No, we're supposed to learn it. We want to memorize it. We want to, apply it. We do have the Holy Spirit in us. That's one of those overlapping things. We do have forgiveness of sins. That's one of those overlapping things where people want to say, well, maybe we get the spiritual benefits of the new covenant today, but the physical benefits don't happen until the kingdom. Except it doesn't say that you can split it up that way.
Right.
Just because we have the Holy Spirit now and they'll have the Holy Spirit in the future doesn't mean that it's the same thing.
Right.
As I like to say, similarity does not mean equality. Right.
Yeah, but and I hear you, right? But no, you want it that way, right? Because you want it to be a nice path and everything to fit together.
Yeah.
Too.
Probably one of the biggest arguments people use is when Jesus at the Passover, that sort of set up communion, right? His betrayal, he said, "This is the blood of the new covenant." We're like, we celebrate communion, therefore we're part of the new covenant.
Right.
But Jesus' blood, Jesus' death, accomplished far more things than just saving Christians, right? If you're saying the blood of the new covenant puts everybody under the new covenant, that's going far beyond the church anyway. So to limit it to the church or to say that we tap into spiritual blessings, I think is really short-sighted. This is a promise. Jesus' blood was the blood of the new covenant. It's ready whenever Jesus comes back and sets up his kingdom. It's all set. That new covenant can take effect. But here in Indiana, and other states and other countries do this as well, a governor or a president or a prime minister will sign something into law,
right,
sometimes months before it actually takes effect.
Right.
In the same way, Jesus died, the blood of the new covenant, it's been signed, it just hasn't taken effect yet.
Okay.
And if somebody's not a citizen of the state of Indiana and they don't live here, then it doesn't matter what bills or laws are signed, whether they're in effect or not. They don't apply to that person because they're not here. In the same way, we're not Israel or Judah. The church is distinct, and therefore we're not under the covenants that God has made with Israel and Judah, old or new.
Right. All right. Well, let's keep moving on. So chapter 32, a little bit of an odd chapter. Jeremiah buys a field.
It's good to know.
Yeah, right. Right.
So personal journal.
So the timing is a little odd, right? Babylon has Jerusalem under siege, and Jeremiah decides now's a great time to buy a field.
Well,
prices has got to be very low.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
To be fair, God said, "Hey, your cousin's going to come and offer you his field. So when he does, buy it." So it's not like Jeremiah was out on Realtor.com. Hey, look at this.
Yeah. So Jeremiah buys this field. So at this point, it's kind of unbelievable, right? That fields would change hands. So, but what's cool about it is the historical narrative.
Yeah.
We get a little insight on how business transactions happen.
Oh yeah, very
and it's
detailed.
very interesting.
Yeah.
You got to have two people. Everything's done up front. You always hear that, you go to the old people at the gate.
Yep.
And they are witnessing the transactions. Yep. Something very similar is happening here.
Your deed, your title,
and you have two of them, right?
Yeah, signing all. They didn't have carbon copy back then, so you got to sign. You thought it was bad to sign for your house. Now you have to do it twice.
Yeah, right. Well, we also know the amount of the transaction, right? 7 ounces of silver.
Yeah.
Well, we have no idea of is how big the field is, or this is either a great or a terrible transaction. We don't know any of that.
Yeah.
But how is selling a plot a good idea at this time?
Well, normally because they were tribal lands, you don't want to sell outside of your tribe. right? And at the years of Jubilee, every 50 years, everything goes back to tribes. Well, this was a cousin. Okay, so this was going to stay within the family. So probably it was similar to the account in Ruth, where Boaz was offered, we have a widow, we have no heirs, so somebody needs to take this over to keep it in the family. I'm guessing it's a similar thing.
Something like that.
So Jeremiah's cousin comes to Jeremiah, says, hey, I've got this field, would you buy it? And I think it's probably to keep it in the family. And God had already said yes, and so, but it sets up a symbol. I mean, it's not just because Jeremiah needed land. There's actually something that's going on here.
Yeah,
right?
we'll hit that in a second. So one of the things that they did, think about where you keep all your transactions, right? Some people have lock boxes. You can certainly go to a bank or register it.
I keep mine in a clay jar.
Exactly. That's very biblical of you.
I just get some pottery, put it in there.
So they have these clay jars, and then they seal them for long term.
Yeah.
Right.
So now here's something that's really cool, right?
Yep. No, go ahead.
Say this?
Yeah.
So in the mid 20th century, they found some caves in the Dead Sea area that had clay jars. That when they opened them, they found a whole bunch of scrolls, and they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls, very creatively.
Right.
And they were written like 2,000 years before they were found.
Right.
Okay. But the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Old Testament that we have, the copies that we have, are only about 1,000 years old. And we're like, well, over 1,000 years, has anything changed? Do we know that this is really the Hebrew Bible that was around in Jesus' time? Well, these Dead Sea Scrolls were 1,000 years older than that, and they actually proved the veracity of these Hebrew copies that we have.
Yeah. So I'm old enough. I think I'm old enough to remember when they were found. Right? Was it in the 60s?
They were probably announced in the 60s, but it was more like the 40s and 50s that they were found. It sort of became public in the 60s.
Right. Because you gotta, what do we have?
Yeah.
And is it what we have today? Let's figure this out
compare
first before we go public.
But to say, those were put in clay jars, and they lasted for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
So when Jeremiah says, this will last for a long time,
yes, it will.
Yes, it will. Probably better than your safe at home.
Yeah. But you said that there's another part of the story, right? And if everyone remembers, we've talked about figs, underwear, other pottery, and yokes, right? And
almond trees. There's been all sorts of things.
Yep.
Right?
And now we have these clay jars.
Well, and not just the clay jar, but why you asked the question? Why is it a good idea to buy a field?
Yeah. Well, he's using it as a visual, right? And yes, the Israelites are being punished, but on the backside of that, we had already said you're going to have farms again. You're going to have families. There's going to be forgiveness, and there'll be life again. Yeah. And it's kind of the understanding that this is going to last a while, but we're going to go back to owning land. We're going to go back to the way things were.
So we don't know how old Jeremiah was exactly at this point. We don't know how old he lived to be, but there's a good chance that he wasn't around 70 years later.
Right.
But this was an investment in the future. His family would have this in the future to come back to.
So plans.
So it makes
people in Babylon knowing that maybe not them, but their offspring,
their family,
will be able to go back. How huge is that?
Yep. The family land would still be there, and they would be able to take it over again.
So, verse 26 through the end of the chapter. Basically, Jeremiah goes, God, why did I just buy a field? Right? I trusted you. I believed you. You told me to buy the field. I bought the field. Now can you tell me why?
Yeah, what's going on here?
So it's him telling him that, right?
And God answers Jeremiah's request, his prayer, and he explains yet again, Nebuchadnezzar's going to do this, but I will do this. I'm bigger than these other nations. I'm bigger than everybody else, and no matter what they do, back to that 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, right?
Yeah. So he also talked. It also talks about the new covenant in there too.
Yeah, it keeps coming back to that. Yeah.
Right. So again, future events, and a lot of people are different things.
So, but let me come back to this point of the dramatic language, okay? Because God says stuff like, and this will show up repeatedly, God says stuff like, I tell you what, the whole world wants Israel to go away, right? Tell you what, as soon as the sun and the moon and the stars fall out of rotation, then Israel can stop being a nation in my presence. Problem with that is that God is the one that holds the sun and the moon and the stars in rotation. So you have to defeat God. You have to knock God off, and then Israel can stop. He says, here's another one. If you can explore the heavens and the depths of the ocean, once you've got that all mapped out, then come back to me and we'll talk about Israel. I can reject Israel.
Yeah.
Even today, here we are
still,
in the 21st century, we haven't mapped the ocean floor completely. There's all sorts of things we don't know. So God keeps coming back to, if day and night could stop, well, who controls day and night, right? Then Israel,
right.
then I can go back on I don't have to uphold the new covenant. I don't have to uphold the Davidic covenant. All these things. Anybody who wants Israel to go away, literally God says, you got to deal with me.
Nice.
So God is the personal protector of Israel.
Yeah.
And I just love that.
Yeah.
This is why I love this section of Jeremiah.
God again says, I will fill their hearts and minds with respect for me, so they will never again turn away from me.
Yep.
And I think that's huge.
Yep.
And, for the last 30 chapters, people have been turning away.
Yeah.
And in fact, since the Garden of Eden, people have been turning away, and and we still have been turning away too.
Yep.
So how cool is it that He's going to fill their hearts and minds, and they will never turn away from Him again?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And that continues into chapter 33, this continuing promise, this dramatic language, this what he is going to do. And in fact, he brings in the Davidic covenant as well this time.
Exactly. Yeah. So if we hop in there, that is probably the big thing in there. There's a reminder in there about the Davidic covenant.
Yeah.
That there's going to be an heir of David's line that will rule Israel.
Yeah. Yep. So verse 17, I think, is really the important part. It's not so much that God says there will always be someone on David's throne, but rather David will never lack a successor to occupy the throne. There will always be somebody from David's line, which is really cool, because Luke chapter 1, Gabriel comes to Mary and says, your son, you'll name him Jesus. He will sit on the throne of his father David over the house of Jacob. So even if David's entire descendancy could be wiped out here on the planet, right now, everybody from David's line is wiped out. Jesus is the successor. There will always be a successor. There doesn't even have to be one. He's fulfilled it. He just hasn't sat on the throne yet. So you could wipe out David's entire line if you could, and you still can't get away.
Still can't.
You can't.
And you got to deal with God.
Then you still got to deal with God.
Right.
He's got it locked up. And I think that's the coolest thing.
Right. So then we come to chapter 34. And chapter 34 is all about a promise to the king, right?
Yeah.
Zedekiah in there. And he was a ruler of Jerusalem, but he was actually installed by King Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit odd, and at least in my mind. So we had just talked about rulers of Israel being of the line of David. So is Zedekiah in that line? Or is it like you said?
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, he's a puppet king.
Yeah.
He's a puppet
exactly.
king. Nebuchadnezzar installed him. What's funny is that Necho, the pharaoh of Egypt, had installed somebody as king, and Nebuchadnezzar took him out and installed his own.
Right.
This was very normal. I mean, kings did this all the time. Cyrus of Persia took over Babylon and installed Darius over that province. So it was pretty normal, because they want somebody from there or close by there.
Even Rome did that.
And and the governors and everything, right? Who could keep things under control, report back to Babylon, the capital, and make sure everything is under control.
Right.
The problem is Zedekiah was a pretty wishy-washy guy.
That's a good one. I thought you were going to say bad. I think wishy-washy is a very good term.
Yeah, I mean,
and we'll see that a lot next week too.
We'll see that in several upcoming chapters.
Yeah.
He really was not a good leader.
Right. Right. Just fight the problem that's in front of you.
Yeah.
More than anything.
Which probably Nebuchadnezzar thought that he would be easy to just push around, and you don't want a strong leader necessarily there, because Nebuchadnezzar wants to be the leader, right?
Right. So he's told he's not going to die in battle.
Yep.
But he has to confront King Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to be sent to Babylon.
Yep.
And he's going to die a peaceful death.
Peaceful death, and if he submits to Nebuchadnezzar, then Jerusalem is also not going to be burnt to the ground. There's all sorts of things that God has promised Zedekiah.
Right. So there's also a thing with the slaves in there.
Yeah.
So what's going on with the slaves?
So slavery was allowed under the Mosaic law. Now, people have a problem with that.
Sure.
But they have a problem with it because of the way we think of slavery. God, in the Mosaic law, regulated how slaves were to be treated, how they were to be paid, how they were to be taken care of. So I don't want you to think slavery like sort of we typically think of it, right? But every 7 years, slaves had to be, debts were released, slaves are released, that sort of thing. So apparently under Zedekiah, they hadn't been releasing the slaves. Under Zedekiah, he made a covenant with them to get back to, hey, we should be doing this.
Right.
And so they started doing that. And then they said, yeah, that's stupid. Why would we do that?
Well, because they're under siege too, right? And
yeah. So then they took their slaves back, and God is like, this just yet another time. This time you made a covenant to obey me again, and you still, broke it.
Right.
So
God promises destruction if they don't free the slaves.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's the end of this chapter.
Yeah,
so,
it's sort of like like an abrupt ending.
Yeah.
This is just sort of like we screech to a stop, and we're like, hey, we're at the end of this week's reading already.
Right. But New Covenant in here, which is definitely big, and hopefully we brought it out to everyone, and also one of the key aspects of the book as a whole is Jeremiah as a whole.
Yeah, and we're going to see that keep coming back up. God is a covenant making God, but he's also a covenant keeping God. The fact that we don't keep what the commands and everything does not mean that God doesn't have to be trustworthy to his side, right? So I think that's probably one of the biggest things. And again, like I said, my favorite part of Jeremiah is the new covenant because of that dramatic language. God just keeps, feel free to try, but you have to do business with me.
Right.
And I think that's just great. There's obviously a lot of other stuff that you might run into. You say you have comments or questions. Definitely send them our way. Love to field those. Love to hear what you're learning as you go through this. We'll pick up here with chapter 35 next time. Until then, hope you enjoy it.
Bye, everybody.